All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Effective Data Use to Support English Learner Students. This is a two-part webinar, and today's webinar is part one, using data to inform policies and practices for English learner students. My name is Melissa Josue, and I'm here on behalf of I'm here from West Ed on behalf of REL Pacific. And I know everyone is super familiar with Zoom by now, but I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping tips before we formally get started. So everyone for the time being is muted, and please remain muted just to reduce some background noise. We'll have the opportunity to unmute a little bit later on when we're in breakout sessions together. And in a moment, I'll be pasting in the call-in information. So if you have trouble hearing audio for any reason, you can go ahead and call in and enter that meeting code. And also, you're welcome to place any comments or questions into the chat. There's a chat icon for most people at the bottom of your screen, and that'll send messages to everybody in the group. And also closed captioning is available. So you should be able to see, if you click on the CC icon in your control panel, you'll be able to see live transcriptions on the bottom of your screen. And also, if you have any trouble, I'm here to help. Go ahead and direct message me at Melissa Josue, and I'm happy to help. Also, we will be sending the slides and a feedback survey shortly after the webinar. And again, this webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending out the recording within a few weeks. So with that, Roger Fiedler is going to be doing the formal introductions and overview.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and welcome everyone to this REL Pacific webinar on effective data use to support English learner students. My name is Roger Fiedler, and I'll be our MC and one of the many facilitators for the session. I'm the Communications Director at McREL International, which administers the REL Pacific program on behalf of the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And I'm being supported behind the scenes today by several of my colleagues who work on the REL Pacific program, who are helping to monitor the chat box, and will also be helping to facilitate the breakout room conversations that we have scheduled a little later on in the session. I'll tell you a bit more about the REL program and today's topic in just a moment, but first I have just a couple of quick housekeeping reminders for the session. As Melissa mentioned, we are asking all participants to leave your microphones and phone lines muted to help us avoid any feedback and to help keep our audio clear for today's presentation. If you do have a question or comment during the session, please type it into the chat box. We will be keeping an eye on the chat throughout the session, and we'll pause from time to time to answer questions. And we'll also take some time at the end of the session to address any additional questions that come up. Our program today is scheduled to go for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how many questions we get, and then also the depth of conversations that occur in the breakout rooms. If you're not familiar with REL Pacific or with RELs in general, the regional educational laboratories are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. And the 10 RELs that are located across the country and through the Pacific region collaborate with their local school districts, state departments of education, policymakers, and other education stakeholders to help them all put research into action. So in each of these assigned regions, RELs conduct applied research and provide trainings to educators and system leaders, all with the mission of supporting a more evidence-based education system and using research in ways that improve academic outcomes for students. Today's webinar is being sponsored by REL Pacific, which serves educators and school systems spread across 5 million square miles, including the state of Hawaii, the U.S. territories of American Samoa, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and the island nations of the Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Republic of Palau. Now, across this region, REL Pacific works with education partners to focus on 5 high priority areas: And these areas are college and career readiness and success, professional learning for educators, language and literacy, social and emotional learning, and data use and readiness. And several of these high priority topic areas are what lead us to today's webinar, where we will be exploring and discussing how to use data to inform policies and practices for English learner students. And while we know our topic is of high priority in the Pacific region, we know it's also of high interest nationally. And we have participants joining us today, not just from the Pacific jurisdictions, but also from all across the United States, from a variety of roles at schools, districts, state departments, service agencies, universities, and more. As Melissa also mentioned, today's session is the first of two webinars we are going to be holding on this topic. So please do join us again in a few weeks for part 2, where we'll focus on assessment system considerations for EL students. Our content expert and presenter today is Eric Crane. Eric works at WestEd, where he helps schools, districts, and state agencies gauge school and student performance and make the best use of the results. He leads assessment and accountability research, evaluation, data visualization and use, and technical assistance projects. He also advises multiple state departments of education on the development and implementation of school accountability systems. Prior to joining WestEd in 2003, Eric served at the California Department of Education, where he managed the research and analysis unit. And before I hand things over to Eric, let's take a moment to review our learning objectives for today's session. We want to help you understand the key elements of data-driven decision-making and how it applies to monitoring the progress of English learner students. We'll also share some research and analysis on thinking about accountability as a cycle of improvement. And lastly, using some breakout rooms, we'll spend some time discussing and reflecting with each other on where our states or jurisdictions are within that cycle. We'll be talking about any areas of need for data, communication, and about next steps to best support our students. And with that, I'm now going to hand the session off to Eric Crane. Eric, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Roger. And again, welcome everyone. I'm really looking forward to today's webinar. In any discussion about data use, it's helpful to start with data-driven decision-making. And you'll see many names for the same idea. Some people call it data-based decision-making, or you'll hear data-informed decision-making, or evidence-based decision-making. I don't want to get too rooted to one term, but the key idea here is whatever term you apply to it, we're talking about a systematic process where data are collected and analyzed regularly as part of the decision-making process to make education decisions. So we can get that out of the way at the top. That you'll hear this go by many names, but we're looking for something regular and systematic that flows in and is an integral part of decision-making. Next slide, please. Data-driven decision-making really has two main components. Now, granted, each one of these is complicated and multifaceted, but it really is about having, on the one hand, technology tools, and on the other hand, having human capacity or data literacy. So the technology tools, they're going to include systems, things like data warehouses, the devices, things that are going to collect and analyze information. And on the other side, the human capacity is going to be things that enable best use of the information. That is habits of mind and culture, understanding about how to use information to inform practice for decision-making. Being able to use information to ensure that policies or legislation is shaped and informed by evidence. So really, those are the two main elements of data-driven decision-making. Of course, each one is complicated in itself. Next slide. Both those pieces that I just described ideally sit within a data culture. A data culture is a learning environment in a school, district, or other jurisdiction that's about values and behaviors, practices that focus on data use by leadership and by participants in the system that will make and shape decision-making. And again, it's got that regularity to it. It's a constant part of how decisions get made. That is data culture. Next slide. So Mandanak in 2012 identified 5 key pieces for establishing a data culture. As I mentioned, it's an ongoing regular cycle. In education, students are a part of the process and they learn to examine their own data and set their own learning goals. District or school leaders, along with the community, set a vision for how data will be used for decision-making in the school or district. Supports and resources are provided to sustain a data culture. That includes time for educators to get out of their daily routine and make sure the data is part of that routine. So time has to be set aside for educators to be looking at data, having discussions based on data. And finally, system-wide, so the larger state or jurisdiction is responsible for developing and implementing a system-wide data system and culture. Next slide. So for data to be effective, a few key attributes need to be present. Data need to be clear and unambiguous. If there's confusion about what the data mean, then the data are not going to be effective. The same things need to be collected over time. There's a consistency in data so the change can be measured. Data have to be feasible, and by that I mean that the measures that we want have to exist, and that they are connected to actions that are doable. And finally, they have to be meaningful. Data need to mean something and be real to stakeholders in the system. Next. Key data for monitoring the progress of English learner students. Let's go on. The results of the content assessments. So these would be the English language arts, math, and other content area results. For English learners, their performance on language proficiency assessments. Teacher reports of students' language learning. Family input. And the student's cumulative file. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And lastly, other factors, and we'll unpack that as well in a few slides. So the first of these, assessment results. When we're looking at the data from English learner students, it's really important to keep in mind that there are different kinds of English learner students. And if we're talking about comparing students' performance and progress to those of other students, it helps to have the closest comparison that the data allow. And so comparing within type, English learner students may include newcomers or students with limited or interrupted formal education, long-term ELs, or English learner students with disabilities. So those comparisons that we make, it's really helpful not to talk about English learner students as a group, unless that's all that the data allow in terms of the size of our data sets. So when we can drill down and get a more precise comparison, it's helpful to make inferences about an individual student's performance and progress. Next slide. Yeah, teacher reports, we mentioned that as another source of data. Teachers are often in the best place to know how a student's English language, how a student's English language skills are evolving. And in fact, if we can get observations in more than one setting, then we can have a more complete picture of the student's level of language mastery. And again, teachers can often identify the difference between a student's conversational English and academic English. So how a student is talking in the, on the playground, for example, versus with the more academic terms in the classroom. Next slide. Family input can come from surveys that the school or district might send home, interviews or the teacher-parent conference, and also from less formal discussion. So knowing where a student is at in terms of their English language proficiency can be informed by conversations and input from the family. Next slide. Mention the cumulative file. These are things that are often in the cumulative file. We can go ahead and just show them all. Report cards, attendance, behavior history, participation in programs or academic interventions, as well as primary language and English language proficiency. So all of these can inform what we know about a student's performance and progress. Next slide. Yeah, and finally, these other factors. My colleague, Elizabeth Burr, who's on the call today, identified several other factors beyond classroom instruction and learning that sometimes the educators in the system will have access to. Information about family circumstances, health, environment, past education history, and any trauma exposures. Certainly, in some of the jurisdictions on the call today, there can be things that natural factors that interrupt, education. Those will usually be more global, but there are going to be sometimes circumstances that affect some students only. And if we look only at the things on the prior slides and don't factor in these things, these other factors, then we may be at risk of making a suboptimal decision for a student. Next. So I want to turn now to ESSA. There are some things in ESSA that we want to pay attention to for specifically for English learner students. And along with my colleague Deb Sigmund, in the earlier days of ESSA, we were talking about this as an opportunity for the jurisdiction state system, to kind of rethink accountability. How do we use data to inform discussions and decisions about our English learner students? So with ESSA, there is an opportunity. We'll talk some more about ESSA. Next slide. ESSA is built on these 4 pillars to promote educational excellence and equity: standards, assessment, disaggregation, transparency, and accountability, and school support and interventions. So we're going to talk a lot today about assessment data and accountability systems, but all 4 of these pillars are key to student and school performance. Next slide. When we're talking about the pieces of the accountability system, I think it's helpful to distinguish things that the assessment and accountability data can provide, and then actions that those in the system might take. So things would be what we measure or what the goals are, standards. Actions would be things like making determinations about student or school progress, generating reports, providing support, figuring out what interventions might be needed, and making sure that we have evidence-based conversations. Next slide. So I include this slide because the accountability topic is one that we often have to relay back to stakeholders in the system, some of whom may be skeptical. So for instance, with a parent who might have questions about the accountability system and its value, or even some of our colleagues, these 6 points are worth elevating. Accountability sets clear expectations for performance. It can help to describe and define meaningful differences in performance. It lets us know what schools or student groups within schools need support and interventions. It presents and produces data that we can use to motivate action. it helps to have a different kind of conversation about the improvement of the system. Without the kinds of measures that come out of an accountability system, there's some risk that conversations can be vague and unspecified. And finally, and in part because of these 5 preceding things, accountability supports student achievement. Next slide. So for English learner students in ESSA, they are a student group for whom disaggregated data are reported. English language proficiency is required under ESSA, and English language proficiency assessments are required annually. And the performance of the English learner student group, like any student group, can trigger participation in targeted support and improvement an ESSA program for improvement. Next slide. So it's helpful to point out some of the other work in the REL network, and so wanted to direct your attention to a resource from REL Mid-Atlantic. This was a webinar that they did in late October of last year called Rethinking Education Accountability Systems in Light of COVID-19. It takes some of these ideas that we've been talking about so far and specifically puts it in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic. So panelists discussed questions about how accountability measures might look a little different in the pandemic, and how the pandemic itself might affect measures, what may have to be paused or done away with in this year to be restarted once things are restored, and how states and jurisdictions might have to think about that during this time. Next slide. So at this point, wanted to invite the participants today to think about a set of questions. It's almost like a prompt to get some thinking about these various questions. In your state or jurisdiction, are data available that allow you to compare the performance of English learner students to other student groups? Do the data allow those finer comparisons to true peers? As we discussed earlier, these were things like students that had limited or interrupted formal schooling, or were long-term English learners, or English learners, students with disabilities. Do the data allow such comparisons? What do the data say about the time it takes English learner students in your jurisdiction to become proficient in English? And then for those who continue to receive English learner services between 5 and 7 years, what do the data say about their performance? How large a group within the English learner student group is that group of long-term English learners? And how do they perform on other measures? So with that, there's sort of a set of questions to kind of prime the pump and prime your thinking. And in fact, thank you. I see Melissa has put a document in the chat, so we can think about those questions, and if there are things that come to mind, things that you are currently able to do with the data but aren't doing, maybe the analysis capacity in your state or jurisdiction is a little shorthanded. These are things that you might think about expanding to. If the data don't allow some of these questions to be answered, what would it take to get there? So some questions to think about. Next slide. So accountability is often best thought of as a cycle, and I think this slide illustrates it well. I'm going to start in the top right corner. We design with the end in mind. So if the end is meeting college and career ready standards at the end of 12th grade. So we start by setting those goals. The cycle of accountability allows us to meaningfully distinguish the performance of schools and districts to let us know what groups or schools might need support and intervention. Stakeholders are thereby empowered to take action through clear data. And the system can continuously improve and innovate for higher levels of achievement. And then we can review and say, okay, what do we need to change in the system? And do we need to redefine, our goals? So there's this iterative cyclical nature about thinking of accountability as a cycle. And this comes from the Council of Chief State School Officers, something that they did some 10 years ago. And I think the cycle is still just as true today. Next slide. So in ESSA, we can think of a pair of accountability dimensions. So there's the who and the what. We're looking at the performance of all students together, as well as disaggregated student groups on a required set of indicators. And we'll drill a little deeper into that now. Next slide. Student groups include all students as a whole, students from major racial and ethnic groups, economically disadvantaged students, students with disabilities. Next slide. English learner students, students experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, and students with a parent who is a member of the Armed Forces or National Guard. So these are the different student groups that are outlined in ESSA, and they're required that we report on their performance. Next slide. So that was the who, and this is the what. So ESSA requires that what gets reported is academic achievement in English language arts, academic achievement in mathematics, another academic indicator, progress in achieving in English language proficiency, and an additional indicator of school quality. These have been in place for a while, and so they may be familiar to you, but knowing that different participants today may have different experience with these, we thought best to review the ESSA required indicators. Next slide. ESSA accountability provisions also include multiple measures and reporting for student groups. More weight needs to be put on academic indicators than school quality and student success. And for participation on statewide academic assessments, there's normally a 95% participation rate. This can be waived this year due to flexibility from the U.S. Department of Education. But in a normal year, that 95% participation rate would apply. Next. So in addition to the reporting that we just described, there's also support and improvement. And schools get identified for support if they are the lowest 5% of schools receiving Title I funds, high schools with less than a 67% graduation rate, or student groups that are consistently underperforming. And again, for a school that has an English learner student group that is underperforming, there may be the trigger here on this third bullet. Plans for improvement need to be evidence-based and developed and implemented locally in partnership with stakeholders. And that's specified as principals and other school leaders, teachers, and parents. Next slide. So we talked about the cycle of accountability before, and let's go on. Accountability is, in addition to being a cycle, is best thought of as a continuous improvement conversation. These steps include talking about the evidence and data, linking that to actions that support achievement, and monitoring for support and interventions so that in fact schools, student groups, and students are continuously improving. Next. So this cycle, the better that the steps in the cycle connect with each other, the better that the accountability system can function. And I think we've got a visual that supports that. Again, this is from CCSSO back in 2011, and it's still just as strong. I'll start at 12 o'clock there at the top. We have indicators of performance. That is the conceptual things that we want to see performance on. And then, there's a process of, well, what do we have to measure that? So an example might be of a performance indicator, might be strength in English language arts, and the measure or metric might be proficiency on a content assessment. And then moving around clockwise, with those measures and metrics, the system makes annual determinations and has transparent reporting so that there can be a data conversation, and that takes the form of a diagnostic review. We're down near 5, 6 o'clock, and then continuing. Following the diagnostic review, we can talk about where different schools fall out and how they might be classified, and talk about actions that would come from the results. That can be in a system that has rewards, consequences, and supports. And then looking at the system, how well it's functioning, reviewing the system, looking at ways to improve it, and then that finally cycles back into thinking about what we really value, our performance indicators, back at 12 o'clock. Next slide. So we're going to pivot now back to Roger, and I think we're going to talk about the breakout room exercise and activity. Hopefully we can generate some good discussion about where our system or jurisdiction is with English learner data and what we might need to improve. Roger, I'll pass it back to you.
Sure. So Eric, maybe we can both maybe preview what folks are going to be experiencing in the breakout rooms. Melissa will be randomly assigning all of us to different rooms. There will be a facilitator in the room who will be asking some of these questions, and we hope to hear in conversation with everyone in the room, talking about looking at schools, districts in your region, in your locality, thinking about these questions and sharing with each other, hearing common situations, common data needs, common goals, also looking for areas of differentiation and need that each of us have, and maybe doing a little bit of sharing and discussing there. We will come back to this main group after about 15 or 20 minutes and do a little bit of sharing out, so that if you're interested to hear what other breakout rooms we're discussing, we'll have a chance for everyone to do a little bit of summary on that.
Yeah, so welcome back, everyone. Aaron, just before you get started, one of the great joys of being the presenter on something like this is you get to float around to the different breakout rooms, and the discussions were so great. We had both questions that related to data collection as well as questions that related to communication. And as I dropped into the different rooms, I heard all of that and more. And so this is the part of today where we where we want to hear from you and kind of what came up in the breakout rooms. But before we do that, and Roger, I'll have you introduce that more formally, but I think Aaron from Hawaii has something to share. Aaron, is this a resource that was developed in your state?
Yes, a resource slash presentation of data that's I'll share my screen and I'll begin the introduction of it. So The Hawaii Data Exchange Partnership is a partnership between Hawaii P20, which analyzes and researches outcomes for from the early childhood field to post-secondary outcomes all through the Hawaii system. So we have data not only on public ECE, but also data from the Hawaii university systems. And so they partnered with the Hawaii Department of Education to, along with support through an Asian American Pacific Islander grant, to kind of go through some disaggregation of their EL data. And so this is, I think the most recently updated year, I think it's 2009, because we all know what 2020 looks like. But this presents a fantastic idea of a resource of showing how the different data is disaggregated to show how different outcomes are happening for different EL groups. And so this is a nice little visual of all of the different languages that are spoken in Hawaii. And you can see there is a broad range. I mean, I'm sure many of your states have similar variety of languages, but you can kind of see that we have, Ilocano, Chuukese, Tagalog, Spanish, Marshallese, all of which have different representations. And here's where we get further information. So we figure out roughly 17% of students in Hawaii public schools are or have been ELs. This grant allows Hawaii to look at students who are former, active, or former, active, and it says it right there, monitored EL, sorry. And so you can see that range of the different groups of students. And I was mentioning this to our group that when students enter the school, if their families indicate that they speak a language other than English, then they are given a proficiency test. And Hawaii uses the WIDA standards and assessment. And so these are the three groups that they see. And then through there, we get further disaggregation of the different regions, how students are kind of spread out across the state. And you'll see that Maui has the highest percentage of active ELs, while Kauai has the lowest. But you can kind of see that they're roughly equivalent across the different islands on the state. And I apologize for going through this really quickly. I know that we have some other content, but it's really interesting to see how schools vary in their performance. And so they break it down further by the complex areas, which essentially are groupings of, we can kind of think of it slightly as districts. For mainland, Hawaii's Department of Education is organized slightly different in that it's a unitary system. So schools are grouped by complex areas. But you can see that some schools have EL populations that are as large as 26 to 28%. So if we scroll down, again, more information about the specific numbers. This is giving numbers to that word cloud that you saw a bit earlier. And so let's keep going down, because I want to show some good news with different EL populations, because this is what this disaggregation allows us to do. Again, further disaggregation of region, but here is where they figure out how are the ELs doing across these different groups. So what's really interesting here is that for students who exited, actually I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. For students who exited EL services before high school are more likely to graduate on time than students who were never EL. And so you can see that it does vary by different EL populations, which, not going into necessarily the reasons why, does kind of give you a sense of when you kind of conglomerate them together, you see that the averages have this fantastic news. We can see that there is additional support needed for some of our Pacific Islander students. But again, this statistic is pretty interesting, right? Like, this is not necessarily something you might see in other school districts across the country. And this data disaggregation allows us to do this and see exactly who's doing well, and almost kind of start thinking about like what is exactly going on this underneath the surface here. Sadly, this report does not really provide that, but it gives you a good sense of further questions that can be asked and explored. So I'll just share this last chart and then I'll switch back to Eric. So again, you see that the exiting before EL before high school are more likely to enroll in college immediately after the first fall of after high school. And I will say that this is just Hawaii education systems in general, or specifically, they don't have data on students who have exited EL and went to a school, say for example, on the mainland. This is just within the Hawaii, ECE to, college pipeline, so to speak. So it's a really great resource. I encourage you all to explore it a bit further. There's a lot of fantastic data to kind of play around with. Thanks all for that.
Yeah. Mahalo for sharing that. That was really wonderful. And I do wonder if the opportunity to get the funding needed is something that the other jurisdictions, may struggle with that, but it is inspiring to see what was possible in Hawaii. And it goes right to the heart of the first slide of our 2 discussion slides. We talked about data collection questions, and your mini presentation in there went right to the heart of that. And I was curious if someone else wants to talk about what came up from their group, as well about the other data collection needs. Clearly, some of the disaggregations that Aaron described, were pretty advanced. What came up for other groups before we go on to the communication?
So Eric, I'll share. In the group that I was in, we had some discussion around how much use of survey data versus testing data is being used to inform decision-making and policy-making at either the local or state level. It was a question we were unsure of, but it was brought up as a wonder. Just, are there states or jurisdictions or localities that are using survey data in some way to inform that decision-making? And then also a question about looking at across the US, are there ways to measure effectiveness of English learner programs to help guide decision-making and determine efficacy and return on investment and effort for EL programs?
Oh, wow, great questions. I know we have English learner researchers on the call, and I would ask if anyone wanted to speak up about cross jurisdictional questions and whether the data allow for that. Thinking about an accountability system and the data that we can use is often an exercise of looking within the system and contrasting schools and school performance within the system. But in terms of looking across from one jurisdiction to another in terms of program efficacy, I guess I would leave that for the English learner researchers on the call and see if anybody has a thought about what are the limits of what we can and can't say. Or alternatively, we can let that question just sit there. But I think it is more challenging because context can vary so much that getting enough standardization so that you can draw a meaningful inference in a very different jurisdiction where there might be a very different policy context, there might be very different programs in effect. So it may be trickier to draw conclusions cross jurisdictions. Before we go on to communication, were there other data collection observations or conversations that folks want to share?
Sure, on behalf of our group, getting to the point, Eric, that you were just saying around how consistency in data reporting, especially with different ESSA requirements, has really helped. recently. We talked specifically about that for home language survey use and the federal 3 questions that are used for home language surveys, and how that has been really helpful. However, then the challenge is in making sure that those are interpreted and entered in the student information system consistently across the different districts, so that that information can then inform decisions later. So we talked a little bit about how a lot of the focus within the accountability world is on data collection, and the challenges of then how do we use that to communicate. So I know that's the next thing, but we talked mainly about 2 different domains of data were home language and how not making assumptions that students coming from Central America or South America speak Spanish as their primary language, because many speak indigenous languages, and how that is kind of a gap in knowledge that we have, and that how certain districts are modifying things to be able to get more detailed and disaggregate data that way. And we also talked about certain gaps in data around EL and special education, making sure that EL students who do have IEPs are getting the services that they need, even if that includes dual language programming, where there is not much guidance or accountability around dual language programming specifically for EL students. And are they dissuaded from entering dual language programming because of their IEP status, where the research doesn't necessarily say that that's best practice, but is that common practice in school districts? So those are some of the areas we talked about and gaps in knowledge that we have in the data.
Katie, I'm sorry I'm sorry I didn't spend more time in your group. It sounded like a very rich discussion. Thank you, Katie.
Likewise, that's very interesting, Katie. Thank you. In our group, in contrast to the, to the data, to the very rich data that Aaron talked about, the issue that surfaced in our group was the lack of ability to delve deeply into the different kinds of English learners. Not just, LTELs, like students with disabilities, LTELs, but also, the different languages that they speak, and all in many in one community. So, and it sounded like that might be difficult for many other places. And so I just find it, I'm so heartened by what Hawaii is doing. It's striking that an external agency did this, but it provides really hopeful news, or that it's possible. Thanks, Eric.
Any other thoughts from the groups on data collection needs before we move to the engagement and communication questions? All right, then shifting to those questions about communication and involvement, did you have conversation in your groups around who is involved currently in discussions around accountability systems, whether that's at the local level or at the state level? Who's currently involved, and how are different agencies reaching out to get stakeholder input when thinking about changes or updates to their accountability framework? Any sharing from the breakout groups on those questions?
So I can share for our group. Much of what we were talking about was a very focused piece, and it was around the large scale versus the student supports aspects of data use and collection, and in also somewhat the disconnect between having data or being informed by data, but also maybe not being as familiar with certain categories of data, and this EL category in that for our conversation was one of those, in that the the leadership was often recipients of EL data rather than consumers and users, and understanding of all of the nuances going into the preparation of the data or the collection of the data, and therefore what that might mean as far as decision making based on those data if they don't really understand all of the aspects around that. And that in places where there are low incidence or very small, very rural places, there may feel much less involvement in accountability discussions because they feel more removed from it. It's something that's happening either on a large district level or a consortium level or at the state level. And the opportunity to influence those decisions about data collection and accountability for EL in particular may not feel as tangible as being in a more concentrated area.
Thank you, Christina.
I apologize for not having the camera. This is Louise in Virginia. I'm the Title III accountability person, Title III coordinator. We try and work very closely and build relationships with all of our Title III coordinators at these divisions across the state. And we hold webinars for them, and we have a consortium conference specifically for low incident EL divisions. And we have an academy coming up in a couple of weeks. We also work with advocate groups. Many of the Title III coordinators are involved with those groups. And we recently just rolled out a SLIFE definition for Virginia. And that was done with full stakeholder involvement at every step of the way, with looking at primarily how to collect the data for the SLIFE points, given that it has to be driven by data collection initially to wave the first flags to start the process. So it's been having a working relationship and literally partnership with those that are in the field to get the hands-on input from how data can be collected is where we are. I was saying to my group that I really hope that we can start to move away from collecting the data accurately and analyzing it in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. Appreciate you sharing that. We have some questions that we offer to everyone. These are questions that you can think about as you go back working in your district, in your state agency, in your organization. Things you can use discussion points with colleagues to continue the learning and application around this topic, and to begin thinking about our topic for the next webinar, the follow-up webinar coming up to this one.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Yeah, just to say a little bit more about the next steps. I was in one of the breakout rooms, and the discussion turned to, that some of these disaggregation, possibilities sounded great, but we just don't have that back in our jurisdiction. So, what do we do? And, my answer then is, was that in this work, we play the long game. If something is the right thing to do for students and for educators, we should start that process, even if we're not going to get an answer or a resolution in 6 months' time or even 12 months' time. So if there are new data elements that need to be collected so that eventually we can make the finer reporting or disaggregation or comparisons, start the process. So that may mean talking with folks who are in charge of data collections. In some cases, it may be a matter that needs a legislative or policy remedy, in which case, who's your champion in the state or jurisdictional legislature who can make that happen? So data elements that are not being collected currently, get that process started. It may be that for a state, it may be that a large school district may actually have a more comprehensive data set than the state has access to. Talk to those folks. What analyses are they able to do that may not be possible at the state agency, and that district person might become an ally in terms of making the case that needs to be a statewide data collection. So that's about the data elements. In terms of the stakeholder engagement and communication, I said it during the presentation that accountability is at its best a conversation, a rich conversation. So thinking critically about who has not been at the table, who needs that outreach. Let's make a seat at the table for them to join the discussion, a data-based discussion about student and school performance. So reflecting on these, maybe even taking some notes and thinking about these, maybe even getting the process started, will set things up well for the second webinar, which is going to be in 3 weeks' time on June the 15th.
Eric, thank you for lending your time and your insights today, and everybody at WestEd and McREL who helped out with today's session. If any of our participants would like to connect with you, Eric, they can do so via your email, which we're showing on the screen right now, or send an email to the REL Pacific team at the address that's shown there. If you are interested in some of the references that were used during the presentation, we'll be emailing the slide deck out to everybody, so you can take a look at those at your convenience when you get that email that comes out. And with that, I think we are going to draw today's session to a close. Want to thank everybody for joining today's session and for joining in the conversations in the breakout sessions. Thanks again, and we will see you hopefully on June 15th for session number 2.